Sundown came, and Andres and Grant kneeled down in their hotel room and they prayed, asking God's protection, asking God to be leading them to the right people who needed these books, who needed to read Steps to Christ. And then they walked out of their hotel room and into the town plaza. The plaza was kind of like the center of town, where everybody would get together. There would be marketplaces, there would be people selling food, and there would be people just around enjoying things and looking and sitting. And so when they came out, Grant looked around. He spotted some man over there sitting on a park bench, and he went over and he sat next to him. And he talked to him. Grant's Spanish was getting pretty good by this point. And he said to him, "So, how are you?" And the man said, "You are the gringo that is selling the books?" I said, "Yes." Didn't know whether this man was going to start yelling or screaming or not. And the man said, "Tell me about your books." Okay, so he pulled out a Steps to Christ, began explaining to him what it was about. And the man said, "The priest said not to read your books. The priest said we should not ever know what is in those books. But if the priest says I shouldn't know it, I kind of want to know what it says. I'll buy your book." And do you know, that was how most of the people in the plaza were that night. There were a couple people who just turned and walked away when Grant came, but most people were actually more curious now because they'd heard about the big scene that Miss Marino had thrown, her temper tantrum, and so they wanted to buy the books. And by that evening, all the rest of the books that they had planned for this whole mission trip up into the mountains were gone. And so they returned home to La Paz, praising God and saying those verses again that had meant so much to Grant. Verse number 1 from Romans 8:37, "In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." And Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Well, the next thing that Grant needed strength for was a couple weeks after arriving back in La Paz, the president of the Adventist mission for Bolivia called him and he said, "Well, it turns out, Grant, that we've had a request from a very important man who wants to talk to you." And Grant said, "Oh, who is it, President Poe?" "Oh, yes, the president of the mission in Bolivia for the Adventists, his last name was Poe, which means that we've got President Poe and co-porter Beans, we've got a bean pole." It's just a coincidence, but that's what it was. But President Poe says, "It's the president of the entire country, Presidente Guerra. He wants to meet you. He has questions about what the Adventists are doing in his country." Grant prayed about it. Andres prayed about it. Jose Gomez prayed about it. All the Adventists there in La Paz prayed about it. And in a couple of days, Grant went into the office of the Presidente. The Presidente had a very big desk. He had large banners hanging on the walls. He had very impressive looking clothing. But he had a smile on his face and he said, "So tell me about these Adventistas." That's how you say Adventist in Spanish. "You Adventistas, what is it you are wanting to do in my country?" And Grant said, "Well, we are wanting to start schools because if people can go to school and learn to read, then they can make better choices in life and they can know how to choose things not only about God, but how to make better choices for their work and their relationships. It'll help them. And we also want to start clinics because a lot of the people don't know anything about health, hygiene, how to keep things clean, and they certainly have a lot of problems with addiction. They get addicted to things like chewing the coca leaves. You might wonder, what coca leaves? Was like Coca-Cola on a leaf? Kind of. Coca leaves is where you make cocaine from. And the people would often just take the leaf from these plants and they'd chew it and it would give them this nice feeling inside that would help them to kind of forget about how terrible their lives often were. Because they had very, very poor lives. They had very, very humble lives. And so they would chew coca leaves. They would drink alcohol when they could get it. They loved the way that would help them just be able to take away the pain, not only physical pain, but the pain in their hearts from having this sadness. And when Grant told the Presidente that that's what he wanted to do to help people have better lives, the Presidente said, "This is a good thing. I am wanting you to continue doing this. Yes, continue doing this." And Grant thought to himself, well, if he likes what we're wanting to do, maybe he'd like what our books have to say. So he said, "By the way, Presidente Guerra, I happen to have a book here called Steps to Christ. Maybe you would like to read it." And he told him a little bit about it, and Presidente Guerra said, "I would like to read your book. I will buy it." And he bought the book. Grant went home, of course, rejoicing. "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." But the next test came about 3 days later when President Pohl reached out to Grant again and said, "There's another very important man here in the city of La Paz, Bolivia, who also wants to see you. And he's not exactly a president. You would call him an archbishop. Archbishop? You mean like the main bishop? The bishop of what? The bishop of the Catholic Church. At the time, the Catholic Church was the main religion in most of the countries in South America. This was back in the 1910s and 1920s. And now the main leader wanted to see Grant and talk to him too. Grant prayed about it. All the people in La Paz prayed about it. And Grant said, "We are more than conquerors. I'm going to go talk to him." He went on the day of his appointment, was ushered into a magnificent room, more fancy than the presidente of the country. This room had thick carpets, it had velvet walls, it had golden chandeliers. It was a beautiful place. And the archbishop sat behind his desk, wearing very fancy robes and looking a little bit scowly in the face. But not too scowly, just a little scowly. And he asked the same questions that Presidente Guerra did about what did the Adventistas want and what was their plans. And Grant told him the exact same things about starting schools and clinics and helping the people have happier, healthier lives. And then the archbishop sat and thought for a few seconds, and then he said, "What you are doing is God's work. It's good." And Grant thought to himself, maybe he'd like to read us Steps to Christ. So he pulled out Steps to Christ and said, if you like what you heard about that, maybe you'd like to read this book called Steps to Christ. And the archbishop flipped through a little bit and he said, "Yes, I would like to have that. I'll pay you for it." And he paid him for it and he took the book. Now after Grant went back to President Pole and told him this, President Pole said, "Wait, this doesn't make sense. Because so many of the other priests get angry when they have these books around. When they find the people reading them, they start yelling about these are heresy and they're going to burn in hell. Why would the archbishop buy Steps to Christ?" Maybe, President Pole thought, maybe he wanted to read it so he could try to find something wrong with it and cause trouble for us. Well, they found the answer out just about 1 week later. Because 1 week later, Grant Beans and the other co-porter, Jose Gomez, were walking through the streets of La Paz, selling books, going down one side of the street. And as they were doing that, down the other side of the street, they saw a big commotion. People all coming out of their stores, coming out of their houses, and all doing this. What might they have been doing? All doing this. They were all doing that in front of a man walking down the street. It was the archbishop. The archbishop was coming down on the other sidewalk, and everyone was rushing out to kneel in front of him and hopefully be able to kiss the ring on his finger or just touch his robe as he went by to show that they respected him, to show that they loved him. And the archbishop was walking by very grandly and very elegantly, walking through, and then he looked across the street and he saw Grant and he saw Jose. Grant Jose thought, are we going to have a repeat of that other time when one of the priests was screaming in the street? But no, the archbishop said, excuse me, and he moved and he went across the street and he held out his hand. Brothers, it is good to see you. Thank you so much. I have enjoyed your book very much. Sales exploded. Over the next couple of weeks, they sold so many copies of Steps to Christ because if the archbishop was reading it, certainly anybody else should read it too, right? Oh my goodness, it was amazing how God was helping them conquer these mountains. But there was a different kind of mountain that Grant was hoping to conquer as well. A challenge, an obstacle that he had been encountering over the last couple of years. Because while Grant had been there in Bolivia, working amongst the people, he had started realizing that most of the other missionaries who would work in these foreign countries, the men, they would have a wife. And he didn't. He had gone there without being married, and now he started to kind of realize, it'd be really great if I had a wife, somebody who could work with me side by side, and we could just help each other out and encourage each other. Well, there was somebody that he had started writing letters to. Her name was Mary. Mary was someone that knew a friend of Grant's, and this friend had kind of connected them by letters. He had never met Mary in person. This was before the time of long-distance telephone calls, of internet, of text messages, of Instagram. All they had was letters. It even took 6 months of letter writing before he even got just one picture of Mary, because Mary had to travel to town and get a picture made, and then wait a month before she could get it back to be able to send it to him. But when he saw that picture, he knew for sure. Because already in his heart, just from the words that Mary had written, he knew that Mary was a strong Christian who loved God. And then when he saw her face, he thought to himself, I can't go on without Mary. I have to get her for my wife. I have to. And President Pole said, Grant, there's a verse in the Bible that says it's not good for men to be alone. So I can give you 3 months, and when you leave this country and go back to America, I don't want you to come back alone. And Grant said, yes, sir. That's in order, I'll follow that. Grant got on a boat to New York. He got on a train from New York to Colorado. He got off a train in Colorado where Mary and her parents met him there at the train station. And by the following evening, Grant got down on one knee in front of Mary and said, Mary, would you marry me? And you know what Mary said? Mary said, I thought we were just friends. Uh-oh. Grant thought he'd already given good indications in his letters that he was hoping that they would someday become husband and wife. But it looks like Mary hadn't quite believed it. Mary was not ready to marry him as he had hoped. Grant thought fast. He set up a quick prayer and he thought in his heart, okay, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Mary, I understand this is kind of catching you by surprise. Do you need some time to think about it? You certainly can. She says, yes, I do. I think I'm going to go visit a couple of my close friends in another town nearby. I'm sorry to abandon you here with my parents, who you've just met yesterday, but I'll be back in a few days. And she left. And for the next 3 or 4 days, Grant worked there on the parents' farm, getting to know them. And when Mary came back that evening, they sat on the front porch out in front of her parents' house, and Grant waited with his palms sweating, and he thought, what's she going to say? I really hope she's changed her mind. So Mary, did you have any good conversations with your friends? And Mary said, I did. I had good conversations with my friends. And in fact, my friends helped me remember a song that we all knew growing up, because I had some concerns about going to Bolivia. I don't speak Spanish. I already have a job here as a teacher. There's people who depend on me. But yet, my friends reminded me about the song that says, anywhere with Jesus, I can safely go. And I can go with you because he's leading me there. What? Grant was so excited. This is wonderful. And then, her parents were right along in the same idea. He went to her dad and said, so as you probably know, I would like to marry your daughter. And her dad said, I see this just the same way like when Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, showed up. And he said, I need to take Rebecca away to be the wife of Isaac. And you know what? I think this is your Rebecca. So we'll get a wedding put together here real quick. When do you have to leave? 2 weeks? No problem. We'll have a wedding ready. And in 2 weeks, they had a whole wedding planned out. They had the ceremony, and they jumped on a train, said goodbye to her parents, and as the train pulled out of the station, Grant said to Mary, Mary, I'm so excited to take you to Bolivia and show you the beautiful mountains there. They're amazing. You're going to love them. They're beautiful. But God has a lot of work for us to do in those mountains, and I think God wants us to conquer those mountains for Jesus. And Mary said, you and I now are going to conquer those mountains together. Oh, it made Grant's heart feel so good. And there were definitely mountains to conquer, because 6 months after they arrived in Bolivia, they made their first trip up into a mountain village together. The village of Irpo Chica. And in Irpo Chica, some of the colporteurs, including Andres Quintin, had been visiting there now already, and they had begun reaching out to some people with their books and Bible studies, and they had a small group of people who are now meeting every Sabbath morning for Sabbath school. And the leader of the Sabbath school was a man named Gregorio Carnaveri. Gregorio Carnaveri was a short little man. He was a very strong believer in Jesus, and he loved to talk about Jesus. And when they talked to him, they said, Gregorio, how is it going up here? He says, it is going okay. Myself and our friend Marco Zantini, we are leading these people, trying to talk to them of Jesus, but we're getting a little bit of scowly from the people. He said, what do you mean a little scowly? Oh, the people, they scowl a little bit, The people who are more for the Catholics, we come by and they scowl at us in the street. But it's okay, we'll be okay. Well, it was okay then, but after the priest of that area found out that the gringo heretic, Grant Beans, and his wife had visited Irpo Chica, he decided things needed to be ramped up a bit. Because the priest, Father Domenico, had received a letter all the way from Rome. Someone had written to him saying, you need to watch out for those Adventistas. Because when those Adventistas get into your town, first they'll start a school, and they'll start a clinic, and then they'll start a church. And then once they get set up, you can't make them stop anymore. So you need to stop them before they start. And Father Domenico had a plan to stop them, because Father Domenico had a man who could stop them. A man that was known throughout that region as the fiercest, meanest policeman in the entire area around Irpo Chica. A man who had a bad temper, who had big knuckles, who carried a long knife, and who was the toughest guy around. A man that everyone called by the nickname of Infierno. Infierno is a word which refers to fire in Spanish, but it's not regular fire. Regular fire is just fuego. But an infierno is where the word inferno comes from. It's a hot, burning cauldron or furnace. And that was what everybody called infierno, because that's how hot his temper was. And Father Domenico said, Infierno, I am needing you to go and drive all those Adventistas. Do whatever it takes. And if you need some alcohol to help you, I will give it to you. How could alcohol help Infierno drive out the Adventistas?
Get drunk.
Not just for Infierno to get drunk. See, when you drink alcohol, does your mind make better decisions or worse decisions? Worse decisions. When you drink alcohol, are you able to figure out what's right and what's wrong very easily? No. And what Infierno did with the alcohol was he went out and he found himself some of the strongest townspeople around here, Pochica, and he gave them alcohol. And they loved to drink alcohol, and they drank it, and their minds started to get a little bit kind of foggy, and it was hard to make good choices. And then Infierno started telling them about all the terrible things the Adventistas did. He started making up lies. The Adventistas were going to come to town, and they were going to do bad things, like burn down the Catholic Church. They were going to chop off the heads of their precious saint statues. They were going to desecrate the cross, and they were going to do all these terrible things. Shouldn't we drive them out? And the men went, yes! And one night, these men, under the influence of alcohol and Infierno's lies, surrounded the house of Gregorio Carnaveri, where inside was Gregorio and his wife, his son, and also Gregorio's sister. And these men began pounding on the door. And then when they barricaded the door from the inside, these men began throwing torches up on the roof. And when the roofs are made of dry grass, as you can imagine, those catch fire very quickly. The smoke filled the hut. Gregorio said, we're going to have to make a run for it. We're going to make a run for it. Wife, you take my sister and our son, and you go out that door. I'll go out the front, and hopefully we can all escape. I will distract them. Gregorio went out the front door, and the mob jumped on him. They beat him up. They knocked him out. And they also chased after his wife, his son, and his sister. The wife and the son got away, and were able to get away to another town where they were able to hide. But his sister was killed by the mob. And when Gregorio woke up, he was tied up in an abandoned hut. He was able to break free from his bonds. And then, in the middle of the night, suffering from wounds, bleeding from his head, he hiked the 30 miles from Irpochica all the way back to La Paz and pounded on the door of Grant Beans. Grant Beans, you're the only one that I can trust now. He told them the story, and they cried with him. They comforted him. They told him that God still loved him. And they said, you can live here with us now. He said, no. I did not come here to live with you. I came to take you back to Irpochica with me because the people need more learning about Jesus, and I will not stop. Grant wasn't so sure about this. Here was Gregorio Carnaveri telling him that these men, under the influence of alcohol, led by a man named Infierno, had killed a young girl. And now he was supposed to take his new bride with him up into the mountains of Irpochica, where even the police would let people kill someone? Grant was not in favor of the idea. But Mary said to him, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. They prayed about it, and a month later, they moved to Irpochica. With the help of Gregorio Carnaveri and Marco Santini, the two leaders in the area, they moved to Irpochica. And there was a hut that the people had built for the new missionary that was arriving, a beautiful little new hut. And as they got there on their burros and began unloading their packs, they looked around, and it was beautiful. You could see out over the valleys, and you could see up into the higher mountains and the foothills. It was just a beautiful place. And here came some of the villagers to greet them. Some men coming out, perhaps to help them move in to their new hut. Some kind of strong-looking men who were kind of walking a little staggery and walking towards them and maybe a little scowly, and just then formed a circle around the hut, looking at them like this. And that's when Grant Beans realized that the man standing in the middle of them was much taller, had big bushy mustaches, and a hat pulled down low, and was glowering at them. And when he made eye contact with Grant Beans, that man lifted up the side of his cloak to show that he had a long knife stuck in his belt. And Gregorio Carnaveri scuttled up behind Grant and he said, that's him. That's Infierno. We're going to find out what happens.